So I don't know if you went to Sunday school or to a children's or youth club run by a church when you were younger, but I know for me one of the highlights was when the leader would get up and tell us a story from the Bible, one of these amazing stories where it always seems to be about ordinary people who have this faith in God, and then God uses them and their faith to do extraordinary things. And it's actually been a story from the Old Testament, and in particular kind of a snapshot from that story, an image from that story that's been coming back to me over the last week or so since I last shared a thought of encouragement with you. So I thought it was the right thing to do to share it with you today, and hopefully as it's brought me encouragement, it will bring some to you also. So if I tell you that the image is of four people walking around in a fiery furnace in the flames, you might quickly remember that that is from the story of Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo. But if you haven't heard the story before, don't worry, because I'll just quickly recap it for you. So Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo were three Jewish guys, and they were good friends with another guy who you might have heard of, which is Daniel, and he's the one who was thrown into the lion's den. And both their stories have actually got quite a similar theme, because they're about the testing of their faith. Because Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo, they were all Jewish, as I said, but they were taken from their homeland into captivity, into Babylon. And because they were strong and they were handsome and they were healthy and well educated, they were chosen to be trained and to work in the king's courts. And they were, like I say, determined that they would stay faithful to God. So they were in a foreign land, they were given new names. So Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo weren't actually their names, they were the names that the Babylonians gave them. But they were adamant that they were going to hold on to their faith and keep God's commands. Now, as we know, Daniel, because he refused to stop praying, he was thrown into a lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo, they had a similar experience, and theirs actually came before Daniel. And what happened with them is that the king of the time, King Nebuchadnezzar, he was a really proud man, and he decided to make a law that when the music played, certain musicians played a song, that everybody should bow down and worship a statue that he'd had made of himself. It was made of gold, it was about 30 meters high, and his law was, the music plays, you need to bow down and worship, and if you don't, you'll be thrown into a fiery furnace. Now, Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo obviously knew about this law, but they knew that worshipping idols was against God's laws, and so they were not going to follow it. They were not going to bow down when the music played. And it says that some people in the courts who were perhaps a little bit jealous of Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo, they basically went to the king and they snitched on them and said, did you know that Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo are not following your law? And it says that the king was furious, so he called for them, and they came before him, and the king said, look, I'm going to give you one more chance. I hear you're refusing to obey my law, but I'm going to give you one more chance. Bow down and worship, or you'll be thrown into the fiery furnace. And it says that Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, they said to the king, they said, look, king, we know that our God can save us from the fire. We know that our God can save us from your plans. And then this is the line that always strikes me every time I hear this story. And they say, but even if he doesn't save us, we will not bow down and worship your idols. And it says that King Nebuchadnezzar is absolutely livid, his face contorted with rage, and he demanded for the fire to be made 7 times hotter. He ordered his strongest guards to come and bind up Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo by tying their arms and their legs, and then he ordered for them to be thrown into the furnace. And it says that the fire was so hot that even the guards who threw them into the furnace died from the heat. But King Nebuchadnezzar, he sat down and waited, and then something must have caught his attention, because it says he jumped up and he went towards the furnace, and he said to his advisors, hold on a minute. He said, wasn't it 3 men that we bound up and threw in the fire? And they said, yes, your majesty, that's exactly what happened. And he said, then why can I see 4 people walking around unbound in the fire, and the 4th looks like the son of a god? And so it says that he called into the fire, and he called Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo to walk out, which they did. And it says not a hair on their body was singed, and even their clothes, such was the miracle that even their clothes did not smell of smoke. And at that point, King Nebuchadnezzar, he just fell down on the ground in awe of what God had done. And he made a new law saying that no one was able to speak out against the God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo. So there we have it. That's the image that's been coming back to me. It's of the fiery furnace with the four walking around in the flames. And, you know, in King Nebuchadnezzar's words, he says, you know, in the fourth person in the fire looks like a son of a god. And some people might say that that was an angel in the fire. God sent an angel to protect them. I like to think that it was Jesus. You know, it says he looks like the Son of God, and we know that perhaps Jesus was there present in the fire with them. So there's two encouragements that I've taken from this image of the four in the furnace, four in the fire. And the first is that I think it's true to say that we will all experience times when our faith is tested. We'll all experience trials, or what might feel like a metaphorical furnace of fire. You know, for some people, it's that feeling of loss and separation from loved ones that we're going through at the moment. You know, we're just so desperate to connect with family and friends as we have done previously. For some people, it's the trial of the mind as we're trying to battle with negative or anxious thoughts. I know for me, the thought of coming out of lockdown has perhaps created more anxious thoughts than going into lockdown ever did. I don't know if you can relate to that. Or for some, it's the furnace of doubt. For others, it's the furnace of worry, perhaps over the safety of our children or over our finances or just the future in general. For other people, the trial won't have much to do with lockdown at all. But what I do know is from this story is if, like Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo, if we can activate our faith, and as we go into the trial, if we can say, Lord, I know who you are. I know that you are able to see me through. I trust you. Lord, I know that you are powerful. And no matter what happens, I refuse to bow down to worry, to anxiety, to doubt, to the lie that I'm on my own or that no one cares about me. What that does, it allows God to step into the trial with us. And we can end up experiencing God's presence in our experience, in the trial, and perhaps in a way that we've never done before, in a greater way, in a more real way. Now, when we talk about experiencing God's presence, I think there are different pathways for different people. For me, I know that my pathway into God's presence is often through worship music. So putting on a song, an anointed song, and just listening to the words and worshipping along, it just allows me to experience God's presence. Maybe you're the same. For other people, it's studying the Bible, you know, reading the Word of God and experiencing God's presence that way. For other people, it will be sitting in nature and just looking at God's creation and connecting with him like that. And for other people, it might just be silent meditation. But we all have different ways perhaps, or many ways, of experiencing God's presence and finding a pathway in. So I encourage you, just in the trial, just acknowledge God, who God is, and seek out his presence. So the second encouragement that I've taken from this image of the four in the fire is that when Shadrach, Meshach and Abendigo were thrown into the fire, they were bound, they were restricted, their arms were tied and their legs were tied. But at some point in the trial, and amidst all the flames, but in the presence of God, they became free. And when they came out of the fire, it was with a new sense of freedom. And I think it's fair to say that none of us particularly relish the idea of going through a time of testing or a trials, because it's hard, isn't it? But the truth is that it's during these times of testing that God can do his most transforming, freeing work in our hearts and in our minds and in our lives. As we're so desperately seeking his presence, he can work in us like perhaps he's never done before. And my hope, I don't know about you, is that I'll come out of this trial with perhaps a greater faith, perhaps a deeper trust, and free from some of the anxieties or the doubts or the worries that have held me back in the past, because I know for sure that God has seen me through. And maybe I feel like we might have a new refocusing in our lives as we realise that actually it's not so much about what we do for God, but actually we're free as we realise that it's just about being with God, and it's about just loving Him and loving others, and what comes out of that freely is what matters the most. I just want to finish by sharing a little time when I went through a trial in my life. And I started by talking about Sunday school and children's and youth work. And it was actually when me and Matt were leading a youth group at the church. And if I had to put a name on kind of the trial that I was going through, it was one of disappointment, because after about 3 years of marriage, Matt and I was pregnant. We went to our scan and we found out that the baby didn't have a heartbeat. And in that moment, I guess what I experienced was the disappointment of hopes and plans that we'd made coming to quite an abrupt end. And I remember at the time that perhaps I didn't particularly want to be around people, just because it felt a little bit lonely, kind of, because what I'd lost no one else could see, I suppose. Like I say, it was the loss of hopes for the future. And that would have been okay, except that in perhaps just 6 weeks from that point, Matt and I were due to take a group of young people to a youth camp for the summer, just for a week. And normally that would have been an absolute highlight of the year for us. It was always a great adventure. But this year, I guess it didn't have the same joy. But there was no way we were going to let our young people down. So we went. And I have to say that during that trial that I was probably still going through of disappointment, God really did meet me in it, and I remember experiencing His presence in the meetings. And how can you not be encouraged by seeing all these hundreds of young people and leaders just worshipping God together? So it was an uplifting time. But it was actually at that week that God spoke to us about new plans that He had for us. And it was actually Matt who came away from the week and he said, look, God has spoken to me, and I think that we need to start a children's ministry. Now, if we'd have thought about that a while before, a few months ago, it wouldn't have even entered our minds, because we had plans of our own. But you know, things had changed and we went, okay, let's do it. So along with our group of fantastic youth workers, we decided to start a children's ministry. We already had a youth group called Freedom, and so we started one which was called Freedom Juniors, the idea being that these children of a slightly younger age would feed into our youth group. And I remember the first few weeks that we started it, we maybe had a dozen children who were children of families of the church already. But then a couple of weeks later, two of our amazing youth workers, they decided to go and do an assembly at the school where we held the youth club and the children's club. So they went, they did the assembly. We didn't think too much more of it, but then the next Friday, I remember just before the start time, we looked out the window and all these cars were kind of driving into our car park. And then we saw as all these families were beginning to walk down the pathway towards the hall. And it got to the point where the registration desk, which normally registered about 7 children, there was just a queue all the way down the side of the building leading out of the gate of all these families. And I think the following week we had over 100 children attend. And from that point, and the 15 years that followed of Friday nights and Sunday morning family services and summer weeks where the children could come along and the young people used to help, we must have shared with hundreds, over 1,000 children, about a God who loves them, and we were able to show that through our actions. And I had the privilege of many times of standing up and telling them Bible stories about ordinary people who had a faith in God, and God used them to do extraordinary things. So out of trials, God can do some really amazing things in us and through us. So I just want to encourage you from that image, 4 in the fire. Firstly, is that if we activate our faith, God steps into the trial with us and we experience His presence like we've never known before. And secondly, when we experience His presence, He can do some really transforming and freeing work in our hearts, in our minds, and in our lives.